Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Susan Coughlin. I'm in Attitude Magazine. And today we have Peg Dawson, PhD, with us to talk about executive function in ADHD teens. Thank you very much, Dr. Dawson, for joining us. Dr. Dawson is a school psychologist, was a school psychologist for many, many years, and for the past 20 years has worked at Seacoast Mental Health in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the Center for Learning and Attention Disorders. She specializes in the assessment of children and adults with learning and attention disorders. She's the author of a number of books, Smart But Scattered and Smart But Scattered Teens, published by Guilford Press, which is a great source of information about ADHD. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Dawson, and thank you again for joining us.
You know, I'm happy to do this, and it's great to reach out to this particular audience. Just a sort of brief background about executive skills and where my colleague, Dr. Guare, and I have come at it from. And it really did come out of working primarily with kids with attention disorders in the early years, and just recognizing that the diagnostic criteria for ADHD really didn't cover all the problems these kids had, and many of those problems ended up being executive skills, which are, and again, probably many in the audience know this, they're brain-based skills. They're located primarily in the frontal lobes of the brain, and they're basically the skills required to execute tasks. So that's point number one about them. And point number two is they take 25 years to reach full maturation. So when we're talking about teenagers, it's really, really important to keep in mind that these are skills that are not fully mature in typically developing teenagers. And what we know about ADHD is that there's a lag still further in the development of these skills. I know Russ Barkley often says that these kids lag about 30% behind typically developing peers in terms of attentional capacities or executive skills. So that means a 15-year-old is more like, you know, a 10 or 11-year-old in terms of executive skill development. So that's really important to keep in mind. The way we've organized them, we've identified 11 key executive skills. You know, every neuroscientist and creator of checklists out there has different ways of labeling and identifying and organizing and clustering executive skills. We identify 11, and I think you may see those in front of you, that we think are most critical to school success, and the order in which, you know, they're listed there, you know, response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, flexibility, sustained attention, task initiation. Hopefully most of these are self-explanatory: planning and prioritization, organization, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition. The order in which those are listed is the order in which we think they emerge developmentally, shortly after birth, starting shortly after birth. But when you get to the bottom of those skills, you know, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition in particular, those really are the last skills to develop. And throughout adolescence, they're relatively immature. And so part of the problems that these kids encounter in school is that people are expecting them to have better executive skills than they actually have. And so that's just something that people should keep in mind. Part of the reason these are later developing skills is that there's a whole thing going on in the brain during adolescence. I mean, there are a couple of things. There's, you know, a growth spurt in terms of neurons and synapses in adolescence, so the brain is now working better and faster. But there's also a process called pruning, which, you know, we're born with more brain cells than we'll ever use. And during adolescence, we start sloughing off those extra brain cells. We're paring them down so that the ones that remain work much better and faster. And that's why at adolescence, kids are improve in their ability to do abstract thinking, you know, cause-effect thinking, that kind of thing, because now the brain cells that are left are better at making fast connections. But what that also means is that we're sloughing off the brain cells we're not using. So whatever kids are spending all their time doing as teenagers, those brain cells are really getting strengthened, and the neural pathways are getting strengthened. But if there are things, so if they're playing hours and hours and hours of playing video games, you know those brain cells aren't getting sloughed off. And I'm not saying necessarily that they're bad things that all video games are all bad, but if they're not having the opportunity to do things like deep reading comprehension activities or things like that, then we may be losing or not taking advantage of a window of opportunity. Decision-making is something that is a slow-developing skill, and particularly during the teen years, teens we make a distinction between hot cognition and cool cognition. If we've got intense emotion or high arousal, then that impacts how we think. And very often that's what's going on in adolescence. So teens are trying to make decisions or trying to think or trying to react under conditions of intense emotion or high arousal, and that degrades their ability to make rational decisions. And that gets exacerbated if they're interacting with someone who's also intensely emotional or highly aroused, as parents often end up being, but unfortunately that can sort of exacerbate the problem if parents become very emotional as they're dealing with a kid who, for developmental reasons, is being emotional. Kids have, our experience with kids with executive skills is that everybody has a profile of strengths and weaknesses, and if any of the listeners are familiar with our work, you may have had the opportunity to take your own executive skills questionnaire and figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are. So there are some natural strengths and weaknesses that occur in the environment. There are some strengths and weaknesses associated with psychological conditions like anxiety or sleep disorders. If you're not getting enough sleep, your executive skills are going to be impacted, which is a typical problem in adolescents. They frequently don't get enough sleep, in part because of the whole school start time piece and the fact that their brains are changing and they're going to sleep later at night. But clearly, ADHD is one of those conditions that basically it's defined by executive skills deficit. So, if people in the audience are dealing with kids like that, then you just have to understand up front, as you probably already do, that your child's executive skills will not be as strong as more typically developing peers, and that can create some issues, especially in high school. And there are also, we'll get into this in a bit, but there are some developmental tasks of adolescence that make it that much harder for parents to work with their kids with attention disorders. So while kids may need to be taught to improve their executive skills, it's often very challenging for parents to do that teaching. At bottom, and this is true with teenagers, but it starts from age 2 practically, that innate drive for mastery, that I do it myself thing we see in 2-year-olds is also very present in teenagers. They want to be able to do everything themselves. They tend to have a misperception that they're more competent than they are, and they've become very good at arguing with parents, because that's another skill that develops, that ability to create argumentation. And so they're very good at arguing with parents for why they should be allowed to do things which parents are often, worried about them sort of taking risks to do. And they may be also making a lot of arguments for why they shouldn't have to do things which parents think they should do or know that it will be important for their future.
And a number of the people on the webinar have said that their own ability to help their child change dramatically or changed significantly when a child became a teen, a child who used to be willing to let them oversee their homework or take medication, whatever, has become very different. Could you talk a little bit about the stages of an ADHD executive function kid in adolescence?
Yeah, sure. And it is more complicated with kids with attention disorders because on the one hand, their executive skills may be lagging behind their peers. On the other hand, some other developmental tasks of adolescence are right on target. So one of the key developmental tasks of adolescence is to break away from parental authority. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, this is really critical. Kids need to become independent adults. And the way they do that is deciding that they can do things themselves. So they become quite resistant to having parents help them. That's a natural part of adolescence. So if you think, why doesn't my kid let me help him? Unfortunately, that's sort of the reality or the nature of the beast. And so, we often recommend a couple of strategies for that. One, whenever possible, we suggest that parents find other people to help their kid rather than them. If they have the opportunity to hire a tutor or a coach or, have them work with a therapist, sometimes as a third-party mediator to help hammer out, okay, here's what I'm willing to have my mom or dad help me with, and here's what I want to do on my own. So bringing in other resources, because that's an intermediate stage between totally relying on parents and becoming fully independent. The other strategy we often recommend is, well, let me broaden that to say there are really three strategies for helping kids develop executive skills, or to helping kids with weak executive skills. One is to control the environment better so that the weak executive skills don't impair the child. And so that's things like cues and reminders, when teachers have systems for collecting homework and for making sure all homework is handed in and for making sure kids write down assignments, things like that. Those are all environmental modifications that support kids with ADHD. The second one is teaching the skill, and and again, the sense I get is a lot of you on this phone call or on this webinar know how to do that and have some pretty good ideas, but you're now at the point where your kids don't want to listen to you. And then the third strategy, which parents really do have more control over, is access to incentives, so that if you can structure the environment so that, or set it up so that if your child wants access to things, whether it's weekend privileges or the chance to buy a video game or, access to smartphones or things like that in exchange for demonstrating that they're using and practicing executive skills. Lots of times these kids may have some of those skills, but they're effortful, so they don't want to use them. So if you throw in an incentive in there, then that may increase their willingness to do what it takes to practice, whether it's study skills or spending more time revising papers or all of those things. They understand how it works and they know what to do, but they'd rather not do it. So the incentive sometimes makes that better.
There are a number of questions about motivation from parents, so maybe we could discuss that. As you said, they know how to do it, but they just don't want to do it. Parents who say they just don't understand why their children are so unmotivated, or why they don't do well in school, don't seem to care, don't work as hard as they could. That's a pretty common refrain on the questions here.
Yeah, and in a way that's easier to explain than it is to overcome.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, again, going back to brain development, at adolescence, one of the things that happens is there's a decrease in two key hormones, dopamine and serotonin. And both of those, dopamine is not only the neurotransmitter that controls the frontal lobes, which is where executive skills reside. So that's the neurotransmitter involved in self-control and focus. But it's also the neurotransmitter involved in the reward center of the brain. The technical term for that is the nucleus accumbens. So typical teenagers have a drop in dopamine, and it's even more pronounced in kids with ADHD. And when there's not enough dopamine, that means things have to be extra interesting or extra rewarding for kids to be willing to engage in it. So that's why you see that drop, what it looks like a drop in motivation. The other piece of all of this is that a key difference between teenagers and adults is teenagers' perception of the future is very different from that of adults. As adults, we can see what's going to happen down the road because we've gone through that passage ourselves, and we've lived longer than they have. Kids have a much more rudimentary form of what is called future orientation, the ability to project into the future. So they really, when they say, I don't need to learn how to write. I'm not going to be doing any writing for the rest of my life. They truly believe that because they can't project, several years out to see, and I think of my younger son said that, he's really into computers. He said that his senior year in high school. He told his English teacher, I don't need to write. I'm going to be working with computers. And then he got a job in the computer industry. He was lucky enough to get it right out of high school. And within 2 months, he said, you know what I have to do? I have to write a report for every time I do any kind of, he was in computer security. When I hack into a bank to tell them what's wrong with their security system, I have to write a report. And so it suddenly dawned on him he needed writing skills. But, I couldn't have convinced him that when he was in high school.
Exactly. So. You mentioned in your introduction something to the effect of that most parents here probably do know how to teach executive function skills, and a couple of people have posted, help, no, they don't know how to teach them. And so they're really interested, people, parents on the webinar are very interested in any techniques that you might offer for helping with organization specifically. Lots of questions about organization.
Okay, and I can address organization. That's actually, of all the skills I try to tackle, it's one of the most complicated. And
really?
Here's why. Because it seems like the organizational system that works for any given person is absolutely unique to that person.
Well, that makes sense, sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
To try to, I may have a great organizational system. If I try to teach it to my kid, his reaction is, that's not going to work for me. That's not how my head works. So I think how to teach these skills, I see it, particularly with teenagers, as a collaborative process, where you start by both of you at least getting on the same page in terms of, yes, there is a problem. And you may be able to use the teachable moment for those kinds of things. When, the kid handed in something late because he couldn't find it in his notebook, which was stuffed full of all sorts of papers. So at that point, you might be able to say, look, I think we got a problem here. I think you're not getting the credit you deserve because of your organizational problem. How about we try to figure out some way to streamline this? The organizational strategies I see that are appealing to me and that appeal to the audiences that I talk to, audiences of teachers and parents and psychologists, are the ones that are the simplest. One binder for every subject, divided by tabs rather than a separate notebook for each subject. There's a guy in Kansas who came up with, I thought it was a great system, where it was using a binder for all subjects, and those binders that have pockets in the front and pockets in the back of the actual binder, so when you open it up, there's a little slot or a flat pocket there. And the first pocket is completed homework and or incomplete homework, and the pocket at the end of the binder is for incomplete homework. So homework is always in one of two places, and everything is in that notebook. Now, for that system to work, and this is the other reason that teaching organization is challenging, those systems can fall apart in an hour.
Right. It looks great, and then suddenly it's all falling apart. Yeah.
So it's a labor-intensive process, and that's why, working with a tutor or a coach on a weekly basis just doesn't work because it can fall apart really quickly. So it's almost like you have to come up with some system so every day there's a binder check to make sure the system is still in place. And teenagers are, I think, only going to accept that if they think there's a payoff for them, not in terms of better grades, because a lot of these kids don't care enough about grades. But again, going back to perhaps those artificial incentives. This sounds maybe lame, but here it is. Can you suggest good incentives? Lots of folks are saying they really don't feel comfortable with incentives that involve screen time because that's already such a big issue with their kids. Sure. Well, let me say two things about that, because the screen time issue is, I want to address this because this is something I've done a lot of thinking about recently. I used to, and I did this with my own son with ADD when he was in high school. He's now 33, so that was quite a while ago. And he would be multitasking. He'd be doing his homework and watching Seinfeld, or doing his homework and keeping an eye on a video game. And, I thought that's the only way I can get him through homework. So, he's passing his classes, so that's fine. I'll live with it. The whole screen time issue has become so much more complicated now than even, what it was, 15 years ago or when he was in high school, because now there's texting and Facebook and, all those things that can go on simultaneously. I am now really pushing parents and kids to think about taking technology breaks, so that they agree. And this is another sort of, let's make a deal on this thing you can do with kids. How long can you work before you take a technology break? Rather than trying to switch back and forth between checking your text messages or Facebook or whatever, and then going back and doing one more problem on your algebra, just getting kids to agree, I will work for 10 minutes, I will work for 15 minutes, whatever it takes before I take, a 5-minute technology break. And I realize there are problems with that, but at least, have that conversation with kids, because kids think they can multitask. A, they can't, and B, there's some research to suggest that kids with ADHD think they're even better at multitasking. In fact, they're worse. Because multitasking is really switching back and forth very quickly between two different tasks or however many different tasks. And actually, ADHD kids have a worse time with that.
Right.
So, getting back
the concept of technology breaks is becoming more and more widely recommended for everyone.
Yeah,
as we're all
exactly.
On screens. Yeah.
I mean, I have to sort of force myself into that as well. But getting back to the incentives, again, I have mixed feelings. I think a controlled screen time because that's maybe the most powerful incentive you have available to you. And I guess the point I want to make about incentives is, what does it do? It encourages kids to practice. And this is all about habit formation when we're talking about executive skill development. So when a parent says to me, I don't believe in paying, quote unquote, wherever that payment looks, paying kids to do things they should be doing anyway, my reaction to that is, if the payment will get them to practice, and if practice increases skill and automaticity, then there's a payoff down the road that's way bigger than whatever, incentive you gave them along the way. I've had kids, some of my most effective incentive systems have actually been fairly lengthy systems where I had a kid who was going to Phillips Exeter Academy many years ago who really wanted a pretty expensive pair of skis. And his parents were willing to buy them for him, but he basically spent an entire year at the academy earning those skis. Now, kids, I can just hear the reaction. Kids with ADHD can't delay, but gratification that long. We worked it out so he earned points for, grades of B- or better on tests, and the higher the grades, the more points he earned, so the closer he got to earning those skis. So every day he had the opportunity to accumulate points towards earning those skis. I had a kid last year in 8th grade where we did the same thing. He wanted a smartphone, and his parents were willing to do that, but they wanted him to earn it. So the entire time he was earning the smartphone, what was he doing? He was practicing. He was practicing how to study for tests to improve his grades, or practicing remembering to hand in his homework. So that was the ultimate benefit of those.
So the concept is an interesting one. What you're saying is, by putting in place structure and giving incentives, we're helping our children learn executive function skills.
Right.
And so I assume that what you're saying is you believe they can learn them, and they will get better at these skills. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I guess, here's the other thing that's important to remember, that all skills take practice and many years of practice. I said the brain doesn't mature until age 25, but some of you in the audience may have read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, where he talks about experts. And
10,000 hours?
Yeah, 10,000 hours, which translates into 10 years, 6 days a week, 3 hours a day. So what that means is, one of my most common phrases with those parents and teachers is, progress is measured in years and not months with these kids. And that you really have to take sort of a long-term perspective. And just, one more sort of point about that. My own son was diagnosed with attention disorder at the age of 14. And, if I had done an assessment of his executive skill strengths and weaknesses at that point, he would have had a ton of weaknesses and not many strengths. And I knew I couldn't tackle all of them. So I basically said to myself, okay, I got 4 years. What do I want my son to look like by the time he graduates from high school? And out of that masked set of executive skill weaknesses, I decided to focus on 2. I thought, and not 2 executive skills, but 2 goals. One was to get his homework done and to hand it in on time. And so those were the ones I hammered home. Every day he'd come home from school and say, okay, Aaron, what do you have to do? When are you going to do it? And all through high school, that was what we focused on.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and he eventually, in fact, he told me a couple of years, this is one of the stories I tell in a lot of my seminars, he told me just a couple of years ago that it wasn't until he turned 25 that he stopped asking himself that question at the end of the day. He would go through this mental checklist of homework. Let's see, do I have algebra? Do I have Spanish? And he wasn't in school at age 25. He graduated at age 22. So he told me this story like, how irritating was this, Mom? I had this checklist in my head that was totally and I'm listening to it and I think, okay, there's the evidence. It worked.
That's great.
Again, I felt like I was shooting in the dark when he was in high school. Is this working? Do I have any ideas?
So, one of the things that a couple of people have asked about is to continue this point of training is their kids in one case, a child who's in the 9th grade, and in another case, another high school student, are okay with one assignment or a one-on-one, a choice, a multiple choice test, but they drown when it comes to either multiple assignments or planning, organizing, and writing of research papers that, have a longer time frame. Do you have any thoughts on those skills? Because those are really killers when you get to college, as you know. That's where things really fall apart for a lot of kids.
Yeah, but here it's interesting you said one's a 9th grader, one's a 10th grader, because here's what I've recently discovered. I mean, that's basically time management and planning in there, and we don't teach kids how to do that. We expect them to have that skill without when kids are in elementary school, we plan their time for them. We don't say to an elementary age kid, oh, you can go to bed whenever you want, just make sure you get enough sleep. Or, you can wake up whenever you want, just make sure you're ready for school on time. So we do all that for them. And then they hit middle school or high school, and suddenly time gets way more complicated. Planning gets way more complicated, and we've not taught them how to do that. We just expect them to know that naturally.
Right.
So, that's why in our work, particularly the Smart but Scattered, I'm not sure whether it's in Smart but Scattered Teens, we have teaching strategies and planning forms, so long-term project planning forms that parents and kids can use together. We provide those same materials for teachers. Ideally, I'd love to see teachers doing more of that, because teachers actually, when I said that it's really hard for parents to teach their teenagers executive skills, teachers can. And that's, part of my soapbox is, trying to get teachers to recognize you guys can teach these skills, and everybody, not just the kids with ADHD, everybody will be better off for it.
Yeah. People are really, really liking this idea of having specific goals, and there's some questions about are there other items that they might sort of tackle, and specifically, what about tackling how to get started, since a lot of kids have a hard time starting something.
And that's great. And I don't mean just to tout my own work, but the Smart but Scattered Teens talks about a lot of this, and particularly around making and setting goals, and has chapters devoted to, if the kid is not willing to work on the goal that matters to you, can you help the kid work on a goal that matters to him? Because then at least he's learning goal-directed persistence.
Right. So focus on the skill as opposed to the end result, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The long-term planning forms that you mentioned, people are very interested in those. Would they find those in your book?
They're in Smart but Scattered. I've got Smart but Scattered Teens here, and let me just see if they're in here. I'm not sure they are. So we have 2 books written specifically for parents. Smart but Scattered goes up to age 14, but that's the one with those specific teaching strategies and forms. Smart but Scattered Teens is really more addressing particularly those challenging issues of, my kid doesn't want to be taught by me anymore, my kid's unmotivated. But let me get back to the goal piece.
Okay.
And I've gotten a lot of feedback from parents on it. They may be parents of younger kids, but they find it really helpful. One of the forms we have is a homework planning form. And so we just ask, parents and kids will fill it out together. When the kid gets home from school, his job is to write down, just list what assignments he has, how long does he think each one's going to take, because that's building time estimation skills. When is he going to start it? And then, if you keep the form going, you can write down when you finish it so you can compare your time estimation to the actual time. To fill out that form, we try to make it as simple as possible. It could be a 5-minute thing. So a lot of kids need a break when they come home from school, but if you have them make that plan first, then you sort of set the seeds for, okay, now the plan has to be carried out.
That sounds great. If you have a form that you'd like to add to your slides, we'll be putting up your slides and the audio and transcript of this webinar on our website, and we can add anything to that.
Yeah,
that you
I can probably
contribute.
That's great. I can give you one of my study planning forms, the one that's more geared to teenagers. I don't think that's in any of our publications.
Okay,
so that's an easy one. I don't have to worry about copyright laws because I don't even own the copyrights for most of my publications.
Well, it would be references.
Yeah. We could get permission, but
yeah.
But actually, I like it better for teenagers anyway, so I can definitely get that to you.
There's a question here as to whether it would be a good idea for a parent to encourage their teen to read the book, Smart But Scattered Teens.
Ooh, yeah, pick and choose though. Here's what's in that book. There's self-assessment so that parents can assess their own executive skills, strengths, and weaknesses, and their kids' executive skills, strengths, and weaknesses. And I'm pretty sure there's a kid version as well, so the teenager can do that assessment. In fact, I know there is. So, and there are pieces in there where we ask, both parents and kids to sort of assess. So, what is my parents' parenting style? And there are numerous exercises throughout the book where parents and teens can sort of use the exercises to begin communicating. It's obviously, I mean, again, having had a kid with an attention disorder, and I would say to him, I remember when he was in college, the book Learning Outside the Lines came out. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Right,
yes. Yeah, one of the authors was there were two Brown University grads, one of them had ADD.
Jonathan Mooney.
Yeah,
right.
I said, Aaron, you need to read this. He said, oh, okay, Mom.
Yeah, I tried that too. Didn't succeed at all. No.
So the likelihood that a teenager with an attention disorder would read Smart But Scattered Teens is pretty minimal. But if you read it and you find pieces that might make sense to them, and here's what I like best about it, and this is that your teen may be able to get through this. There's a third author on that book, and that is my colleague and co-author, Dick Ware. His son, Colin, who's a gifted writer, wrote all the vignettes, and he has this way of capturing parent-teen dialogues that is just so authentic. So at least, and for each of the executive skills, we have individual chapters on each executive skill, and we lay out a scenario or a vignette and then propose solutions to the problem posed in the vignette. And Colin wrote all those vignettes, and I think, and we also have, when we discussed the possible solutions to it, we also had teenagers read the same vignettes and solutions and react to those, saying, well, I don't think that would work, or here's how I would handle that. So we tried to get as much teen input as we could into it, so those pieces may be of interest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can you tell us what are the vignettes? One of the ones that seems the most...
Yeah, one of my favorite is of let me see if I can find it, of a kid breaking the speed limit, and just, when he's just gotten his license and getting pulled over and for that, but the way Colin described what that must have felt like for this kid driving fast on the highway, because that was what he wanted to do. And then we have a number of ones where there are conflicts between parents and teens about how much time kids are going to be spending on homework or when they're going to get it started, those kinds of things. There's one for each one, so organize problems.
Well, there's so many people here who are asking what to do about the fact that their child will not let them help, will not let them comment, will not let them teach. And so any advice you have on that, I think would be very welcome.
Yeah, and that is so frustrating, and that is so completely normal. And I know, I know that's frustrating, but kids, they're really programmed to do that, to not want their parents to help them. So, as I think I said earlier, whenever possible, if you can enlist someone else to do that helping piece. I've had kids who didn't want to be coached, but when we said, if you work with a coach, that'll get your parents off your back. I said, oh, okay. Oh, we're willing to do that. So, and again, as I said, that's the intermediate step, is someone else helping the kid. So that, number one. Number two, I think parents just have to sort of set ground rules, and we talk about this in Smart But Scattered Teens as well, so that their kids may not be willing to accept help, but they need to understand there are consequences to getting poor grades or making stupid decisions or those kinds of things. And so if parents can set up front, here are the ground rules. If you want to do what you want to do on weekends, you don't have to accept help from me, but you've got to show me that you've got test grades that show that you aren't failing that class, or whatever. So
it sounds like you're in favor of both consequences and also incentives, sort of on either side of this, sort of.
Yeah. And it often has to be that way, because for some kids, the consequences you want to avoid are those long-term, you're grounded for the rest of the year consequences.
Right.
They have to be relatively confined or prescribed, and there has to be a clear path away from the consequence. So if this is the negative consequences, here's what we do to correct that, not that sort of loose bring your grades up.
Right.
And that's why I favor those fairly precise and somewhat complicated at times incentive systems where kids are accumulating points, because they say, you know what, you get this many points, then the weekend is yours, kind of thing, because that's what parents have access to. And I know it's frustrating, but I also know that trying to impose your help onto kids who don't want that help, it's probably going to make things worse.
Right, right.
In terms of long-term relationships.
Someone's commenting in support of what you just said about measuring progress in years. You said, yes, life is a marathon, not a sprint indeed.
Yeah.
So it's all people who are. To the person who just asked what was the name of the book she referenced, it's Smart But Scattered Teens.
Right.
So going ahead with that. Can we just return for a second to the parents' emotions? There are a number of people here one person who said, my husband just keeps calling my child lazy. And another person who says, I feel disrespected and undermined personally. And a third says, how do I deal with my own emotions around grappling with a child whose behavior is so different from what I would expect? Do you have any advice for parents?
Those are all common things. When I mentioned earlier that whole notion of hot cognition, I think the important thing to understand is that's the state of arousal that teenagers are typically in. They get hot fast, and if you're hot as well, it's only going to make it worse. And I know it's really hard to sort of control your emotions under those situations, but it may be easier to do that if you cannot take it personally. I remember, I'm like 63 years old now, but I remember my mother, my older brother gave her a hard time, and my mother had this quote, and she scotch taped it to the inside of the kitchen cupboard. And I remember when I first read it, I was like 10. I had no idea what she was talking about. But the quote said, "Face it, Ma, mothers are to reject." And she just had to remind herself of that sort of every day. I will give you another resource, though, around that whole issue. There's a book called Your Defiant Teen, 10 Steps to Resolve Conflict and Rebuild Your Relationship. Russ Barkley is the primary author of that. You can get it at Amazon. But there's a chapter in there where they talk about communication skills and working on communication with your kids. So, for instance, and they've got a table in there, just sort of saying, if your family does this, call each other names. Try to do this instead. Express anger without hurt. If your family does this, put each other down. Try to do this instead. I'm angry that you did. Say things like that. So I think that's helpful. There was another point.
That sounds very practical.
Yeah.
He did a webinar for us. He was terrific, but very strict. I mean, his point of view was, these are the consequences, and you as parents will enforce them.
It's interesting.
Sort of,
Barkley, I mean, his experience, I've heard him speak several times, and he really comes out of those extreme hyperactive, impulsive kids. And so, with those, you do have to bend over backwards. I had a professor in grad school who was really a mentor to me, and at one point I was watching him run parenting classes, and it's the only thing I remember out of watching him for 8 weeks. He told the parents in those parenting classes, a good parent is a parent who makes the right decision 51% of the time.
Right.
That's doable.
That's doable, right. Yeah.
I know what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about lazy.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, I have such a strong reaction to that.
I know. It's a terrible statement, isn't it?
And it comes out of people's mouths without even thinking. And my reaction to, my immediate reaction to that is, what's the intervention for lazy? anytime you're going to call a kid something, you better have an intervention in the back of your head. There are no good interventions for lazy. I mean, there are interventions.
It's a character statement. It's not.
It is, exactly.
Right.
And then I think of my older brother who probably grew up with an attention disorder, and I'm sure he got called lazy by both my parents, who were very good parents. My mom was the world's best kindergarten teacher, but she had been valedictorian of her high school class, and then her older son comes along and he doesn't do homework. So I'm sure lazy escaped her lips. And here's what I saw. Actually, that's how I diagnosed his attention disorder as an adult. He kept saying to me things like, "Oh, I couldn't go to law school, I'm lazy." Or he's a teacher, "I couldn't become a principal, I'm lazy." And I said, "Mike, I don't think you're lazy. I think it's an attention disorder." And so what it dawned on me was, after a while, no one else has to call the kid lazy. He's going to start calling
They're saying it themselves. Yeah, that's the worst part.
Yeah, and it closes doors, and it shuts down motivation, and So
they need a great deal of encouragement. Obviously, yeah.
Yeah.
Back to one skill that's come up here in the questions is working memory. People are wondering, do you recommend anything specific for helping children develop their working memory skills? I thought my sense was that working memory wasn't something that you could improve upon, that you needed to work around it. Is that correct?
Well, and that's pretty much how I feel about it, but parents may be referring to all those brain training programs out there like Cognitive.
Exactly. I think there's always interest in knowing whether those work.
I've tracked that research pretty quickly, from the point where CogMed, for instance, which is a computer working memory training program, which supposedly improves not just working memory but reduces some symptoms associated with an attention disorder. I've tracked it from the start, and the evidence initially was fairly flimsy. I mean, they've compiled a fair amount of evidence which looks impressive, but I've recently come across a number of summary articles. They do something called meta-analysis, where they basically summarize all the research to show the efficacy. And they said the problem is there's very little evidence to show that the improvement generalizes to non-computer-based tasks.
Oh.
So CogMed improves your ability to do working memory tasks on the computer.
Right.
I did a workshop in L.A. last year, and I asked some in the audience, "So, does anybody have experience with CogMed?" And this woman raised her hand, and I said, "And was your experience positive?" She said, "Well, let me put it this way. My child went through it. He's at school today. His assignment book is at home."
Oh, dear.
And, that's the frustration. And so I guess if I were, my first inclination is to use technology, help kids identify what prompts can they find in their environment to remind them, what they need to do.
Right.
Can they use the reminder program on the iPhone, for instance, or alarms, those kinds of things. And then if they're going to try to practice working memory, I would just practice in real life. And usually, by way of checklist. It's possible if you create a going to school checklist that lists all the things you have to bring to school in the morning, and you go through it again and again and again, you may internalize that checklist in the same way that my son internalized that. Okay, so what do you have to do for homework, and when are you going to do it?
Right.
That's a better way to practice, I think, than playing computer games, unfortunately, because they just don't generalize.
Just moving to some sort of comorbidities, if you want to call them that, but some other coexisting conditions. The couple questions about teens with a great deal of anxiety or developed anxiety around doing their homework around school functioning in many ways, finding it so overwhelming organizationally and becoming really anxious as a result. Is anxiety something you see often in attention disorder, kids with attention disorder? What's your advice on managing that?
Yeah, I see it in a set of kids with ADD. I mean, I see a fair number of ADD kids who aren't anxious at all. You wish they were a little more anxious. They might try harder.
This is the opposite of the non-motivated kid, right?
Right, exactly. But when I do see it with kids with attention disorders, it is often worse because what they're anxious about is those ADD symptoms that are going to sort of cut them off at the knees. They're anxious about what they might have forgotten, or especially when it's around deadlines or things like that. Or those kids, probably the worst combination I've seen is a kid with ADD and anxiety around performance anxiety, perfectionism.
Yep.
So, ADD has its own set of problems with task initiation. Procrastination is huge with those kids. But kids with perfectionism procrastinate too because they have such a high standard for what they want the final product to look like that they don't even want to start because they know they're not going to live up to their own standard.
How do you differentiate in diagnosis between an anxiety disorder versus just the reasonable anxiety that comes from having attention deficit disorder?
Well, with all of these things, I do it using norm-referenced, anxiety scales, both for the kid to take and parents, and particularly parents, because teachers may not see anxiety. Kids can mask it in the same way that teenagers can mask attention problems at school, but parents can see it. It's part of the clinical interview and everything else that I do, but I do want to, I'm looking to see, are they sort of off the charts in terms of how they might respond to an anxiety questionnaire, or are their parents showing them off the charts? Because, again, sometimes kids will deny that they have it, but they do.
Moving over to another topic, which is lying. There are 3 or 4 people here who said, their child will say they've done their homework when they haven't, or their child just lies routinely.
Yeah.
And something that seems to have come up in the teen years.
Yeah, and that's a tricky. From the experiences I've had coaching kids, what I've learned from that is you may call it lying. Kids think of it as taking the path of least resistance.
Okay.
So these kids are stuck in the present. So when they're stuck in a painful present where they're about to get nailed for something, they will do whatever it takes to get out of that unpleasant present with the least amount of punishment. So they'll say they handed in their homework when they didn't because that gets their mom off their back right here and right now. It goes back to that future orientation. They can't look down the road and say, man, I'm going to get in real trouble when my mom figures out that I actually didn't hand in that homework.
Right.
It's how can I get out of this situation right now? And the only way around that, I wouldn't necessarily, obviously you want to encourage kids to tell the truth, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time getting on their case about lying. I'd figure out ways to verify.
Okay.
So, emailing teachers on a weekly, and this is how Dick got his son through high school. Every Friday or Thursday night, he would email all his teachers and say, just let me know, did he do his homework this week? Are there any missing homework assignments?
So don't don't try to change your child's behavior. Just let them know that you're going to know the reality.
You're going to figure it out. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Similar to the anxiety, there are a number of people who are asking about depression in their children with ADHD, teens with ADD, and that affecting their executive function. Is that something that you tend to see? How does that?
Yeah, and part of that is and I see it even more in young adults. Depression becomes more of an issue, especially young adults for whom the attention disorder was not treated successfully in high school. So it's a cumulative effect of the failure associated with the attention disorder. And it may be familial, there may be biological, but a lot of times it's situational, and it's the result of the frustrations of having day in and day out to try to manage the attention disorder and the frustration associated with that. We haven't talked about medication, but sometimes that's the answer, either medication for depression or anxiety and or ADHD. I think especially by adolescence, I'm often seeing kids who are on a stimulant for the attention problems and on an anti-anxiety medication or antidepressant.
Interesting, yeah. One question that's come up, or to your point of, I'm going to teach these 2 skills by the end of high school. A couple of folks have posted that their son or daughter is going off to college soon, in a year and 6 months, and they're asking, what are the 1 or 2 things I should really work on between now and when they go to college? I think everybody's universally concerned about that college transition.
Yeah, and it may be too late to work for an extended time on any of those skills, but I think thinking about how to prepare your kids for the reality of college, and again, that's going to be hard because kids are going to think, oh no, I can handle college just fine, but my experience with kids with attention disorders is the thing that trips them up as much as anything in college is time management.
Right.
They get to college and they think, hey, I only have 2 classes a day. Look at all this free time I've got. Compared to high school where you're in school from 7:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon with no downtime. They have tons of downtime, and so they think, I'm not going to have any trouble getting my work done. And the problem is they almost have too much downtime, and they don't know how to manage it. So I guess if you were going to work on one skill, if you could do it at home in terms of time management, getting them to be thinking about how much time they're allocating for this, that, or the other. But the other thing is just having a pretty serious conversation with kids before they go off to college and say, here's where the trouble spots are likely to be in college. So time management is one, and again, I'm thinking of my own son, and he did fine in college, but when I talked with him about what the issues were, it was the competing things to do besides studying that were so attractive. So where kids study, my son realized pretty early on that he could not study in his dorm because there were too many interesting conversations going on and too many video games being played. So he set up a habit, and if you can talk with your kids about establishing good study habits from very early on, he was in the library from 6 o'clock in the evening until 10 o'clock in the evening every night, at least Sunday through Thursday. And he earned the reputation, people called him Library Boy, because they just always saw him there. And then, at 10 o'clock, he'd sort of give himself permission to go back and hang out with his friends. And so it's another variation on that technology break. If we can get kids to establish a fairly firm study schedule so that they can earn as a reward, the downtime to hang out with friends or do the other things they want.
Right. So yes, the time management and how you're going to manage the noise.
The competing interests, yeah.
Competing interests, yeah. It's really a tough one. I guess, let me just see, there are so many questions here that are very specific.
But while you're looking for things, let me just give people a quote. And people may have
That'd be great.
Quote, but it's one of my favorite because it sort of captures the problems that parents have. And it's a quote from Mark Twain. Mark Twain said, as a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in 7 years.
That's great.
And that's just another sort of a piece of encouragement. Take the long view on this. The kids will emerge from that tunnel eventually, and they may even tell you, as my son did, my State School Psychology Association gave a roast for me because I was really involved in them, and I invited my 2 kids to participate in the roast. And it wasn't until that, and, they told lots of funny stories about me, but my oldest son, the one with ADD, sort of in passing suggested that maybe some of those strategies that Mom had suggested to him when he was in high school were actually really helpful. He never would have told me that at age 17 or 18, but he could at age 25. So.
Well, thank you so much for all your thoughts. Everyone on board, please have a look at Dr. Dawson's book, Smart But Scattered Teens, just out. And thanks again.
Thank you. Yep.
Bye-bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.